So hello everybody, and I'm very happy to tell you about the work that Antonio and I did on SAT-based encoding for optimal decision trees. Now, to give a little bit of motivation, imagine that you're deciding whether to submit a paper to SAT, and you already have some track record of papers that were accepted and rejected, and you made some observations during your career. And you noticed that it was very important whether the paper was innovative and whether the results were good or bad and how close you are to the deadline of the paper. And you write down what was the status of these observations in the past and whether it turned out to be a good idea to write the paper or not. And you get a table, and you're trying to make sense out of it, but it's just too large and you're not sure if there are some rules. So you learn a decision tree, right? And the decision tree is typically much smaller than your table and gives you some very clear rules on how to behave in the future. So in this particular example, we are told that if it's innovative and the results are good, and we should definitely write the paper. If it's innovative but the results are not good yet, then maybe it's better to wait and improve the results. If, however, the paper is not so terribly innovative, then maybe just look at how close we're to the deadline, because if the deadline is too close, we're not able to write a nice polished paper. And if, however, we have enough time, even with not so innovative results, we can get a good paper. Okay, so this is the motivation. We're given a set of samples and we're trying to come up with a decision tree. Now, we're not just trying to find any decision tree, but provably smallest decision tree. And why is that? Why smallest? Well, this is just Occam's razor, right? So you're trying to find the smallest tree, which is the simplest explanation for your observation. And you believe that it's going to generalize better. So this is a common practice. Now, why it should be provably the smallest tree? That comes from the fact that current approaches, or the approaches that are typically used for learning decision trees, are based on some heuristics that hope to find a small one, but there is no guarantee. So when we use SAT, we get the opportunity to really find the smallest one and get a guarantee that it's the smallest one. And how are we going to do it? Well, it's fairly standard. So we ask the question whether there exists a tree of size n, and we pose the question to a SAT solver, and then we iterate over n to get the smallest size. However, in this work, we're not just looking at the size of the tree, but also at the depth, right? So we might not be looking just for the smallest tree, but the most shallow one. Both are important metrics. Okay, and now, do we have any evidence that this makes any sense to look into this problem? And the answer is yes, right? So this is an example that we came across when doing our experiments. So on the left, you see a decision tree calculated by a heuristic approach by a state-of-the-art available package that a lot of people use, sklearn. And on the right-hand side is a tree that we calculated by our approach, and it's the most shallow tree as well as with the least number of nodes. And you can observe that it's not only much more shallow, but also smaller, right? So our tree has depth 6 and 29 nodes, whilst the one that comes from a heuristic has 11 the depth and 37 nodes. Also, the existing other approaches on this particular problem fail within 1,000 seconds. Okay, so this is the motivation and the setup. And how do we go about encoding this problem into SAT? So the current approaches that exist, they have one thing in common. They model the tree as if it was a DAG, and then they impose the tree structure. However, we took a different approach that we expand the tree as a set of paths, and then we need to impose some conditions that ensure that the paths make up the tree. Now, this has some advantages. The main one is that we have a tight control over the tree's depth, because we just say this path has to be at most as deep as we want, and that controls explicitly the depth of the whole tree. Also, we get rid of some cardinality constraints, because within the trees, you need to ensure that every node has at most one parent and at exactly two children. We don't need these cardinality constraints in our encoding, because it just comes from the fact that we model the tree as a set of paths. Another advantage is that there is no notion of leaf and internal nodes. Every leaf corresponds exactly to one path, right? So when I say path, it actually is exactly one leaf, because the path corresponds to the path from root to that leaf. Okay, so we don't need to model leaf explicitly in our encoding. Okay, so how do we go on about modeling trees as sets of paths? So this is a trivial observation that everybody in computer science is aware of. I can just run DFS and expand any tree into a linear number of paths. So for instance, in this case, I get paths ABC, ABDE, ABDF, and AG. And these paths share some prefixes. So that's also fairly obvious. So for instance, the first two paths, ABC and ABDE, they share the prefix AB. That comes from the fact they diverge on the node B, right? So both paths, they go to node B from the root, and then they diverge. The first one goes to C, second one goes to D. The same thing in the second and third path. So they diverge on the node D, obvious. And the penultimate and the last path, they actually diverge immediately in the root, so they only share one node. Okay, so this is fairly obvious and a clear observation. And now, how do we model these paths as Booleans? Well, that is also not that complicated, because we just need to record how they evolve. So what is the direction of each path in each step, whether it has already terminated, and it's also useful to know whether it's equal to the previous path or not. So whether it has already diverged or not. So this means that for each path and for each step, I record these three Boolean variables, whether the path has gone right or not, whether it has already terminated, and whether it has diverged or not from the previous path. Now, just to give a small example, consider this tiny tree with 3 nodes A, B, C, and 2 paths. So we have the path AB and AC. The AB goes left, the AC goes right. And now, how do we model that in Booleans? Well, the path AC goes right immediately. Then it terminates in step 3, right? So the first 2 steps, it does not terminate. And it is equal to the previous one only in first step, right? So this gives an assignment to these Boolean variables. I wrote this star in the go right variable in step 2 and 3 because we don't care whether it goes left or right, because it is already terminated. Okay, so there is a clear mapping between paths and Boolean variables. And what rests now is to impose constraints that ensure that each path eventually turns out to be a path in the tree, and we get a tree, a binary tree in the end. So what is the corner idea? The corner idea is that if I look at the directions of the paths and I write them down, I actually get Boolean representation, and these are binary numbers going from all zeros to all ones, right? So the first path, the path that goes left, left, is 0, 0. The last one is 1, 1. And we have some paths in the middle, right? So this is true for a complete tree. So if I have a complete tree, I get all the binary numbers from 0, 0 to 1, 1, 1, okay? However, we do not consider only complete trees, but trees where things may disappear. And there, we need to be a little bit more careful. So what happens is that, for instance, if I delete the nodes N4 and N5 from this particular example, I need to sort of pretend that these binary strings that I have deleted in the middle are still there. So the next path has to come after them, right? So I cannot somehow mix up these paths in a way that would not correspond to a tree. Now, how do we impose these rules on our paths to make up a tree? Okay, so the question is, so this doesn't really, this does not depend on the fact that it's a decision tree, but it also depends just on the fact that it's a binary tree. So how do we impose rules on paths to make up a tree, binary tree? And the rules that we use in our encoding are the following. So the first path always goes to the left. That's fairly obvious. The last one always goes to the right. That's also clear. Then we don't allow the paths to cross, right? So if a path goes right, the next one also has to go right. And then another rule that is probably the most interesting one here is to prevent sort of gaps in the tree. So if we look at this example here, we have the root here. So first we have root, then the path goes to some node S, and then we have two paths that diverge from S. So one went left, the other went right. And now we need to impose the rule that the one that has gone right needs to keep going left, and the other way around. The one that has gone left must keep on going right. Otherwise, we would end up with gaps in the tree, and it would not be a binary tree. Okay. Okay, so these are the main rules that we impose on the paths to make up a binary tree. Now, how do we encode the semantics, which are the classification of each of the leaves and how they combine with the samples that we have observed? So that is fairly straightforward. So each class is assigned to a path. Okay, so each path has a class. It is either positive or negative. So we just use one Boolean variable. And each node is assigned a feature. So this was, which was whether this should decide, let's say, whether a paper is innovative or not, right? So whether that particular node should ask the question. And then we just say, well, if some sample reaches the end of a path, then that path has to be positive if that sample is positive. And the other way around, if a negative path may reach the end of a path, that path needs to be labeled as negative. Okay, so this is fairly straightforward. Okay, so we also did a bunch of optimization techniques in our encoding. So one thing that has turned out to be quite useful, fairly straightforward, but useful is that we prohibit paths that don't match any sample, right? So there are no useless leaves. So if there is a leaf, it must match at least one sample in the training data. Then we identify something which we call pure features, which are features that always have a certain polarity in all the samples. Then we have these quasi-pure features, which are features that have a fixed polarity for a certain category, for a certain classification. Then we also calculated some path lower and upper bounds. This is essentially the same as calculating the smallest and the largest possible prime implicant or prime implicate or implicant. Okay. So these are these kind of small optimizations that we did in the encoding. And the last optimization we did, which is probably the most important, is topology enumeration. So we have observed that for small decision trees, you have a fairly small number of topologies. So for instance, on this example, I have 5 nodes. I only have 2 topologies. Either the nodes 4 and 5, they hang off 2, or they hang off 3. So there's only 2 possible topologies with 5 nodes. And if I write down the possible topologies, the number of possible topologies for more and more nodes, they start growing, but we're still in fairly small numbers of up to 30. So we decided to split up the search space based on the topologies, right? So rather than telling the SAT solver to come up with the topology, we just split the search space, and then the SAT solver only needs to come up with the labels of the tree. This can be seen as some sort of a variant of cube and conquer technique, but it's informed by the problem, right? So before actually dealing with the SAT solver, we look at the problem, we look at the topologies, and we split the problem by topology. Little bit on how we deal with the iterative SAT calls, right? So we need to call SAT solver many times. It has turned out always better to start from smaller to larger trees. So it's unsat SAT progression, and it's done in linear fashion. We either can iterate over depth and then size, or just directly over size. And the topology enumeration combines iterative SAT calls or non-iterative SAT calls. So if we have many SAT calls, we use assumptions, and we have iterative SAT calls. Otherwise, we just rebuild the SAT solver from the scratch. If the number of topologies gets large, we support something which we call partial topologies, right? So we left part of the topology undefined, and that lets us mitigate the number of topologies. Okay, so let us look at the results. So if we look at the path-based and the DAG-based approaches, they are fairly similar. In both cases, it helped to use topologies, right? So we did a very significant improvement. We solved more instances when we split the search space by topologies. Actually, in the DAG-based, the existing approach benefited a little bit more from splitting by topologies. However, the best approach has turned out to be by minimizing the depth first and then the size. Of course, we're a little bit comparing 2 different things because the metric is not the same. So the first 4 results minimize size, whereas the path-based approach, the path-based minimal depth, minimizes depth and then the size, right? So it's not the same criterion. However, there is a guarantee that this is provably the most shallow tree and most the smallest within the most shallow trees. So, so this is still guaranteed to be optimal within that criterion, and we can solve significantly more instances. And just a remark, this last line is a baseline to which we compare to this. So this is an existing tool. So actually, by doing some careful implementation, we did quite a bit of an improvement in the number of solved instances. We also looked at the distribution of the sizes, and this is probably the most bitter slide for maybe not only for us, but maybe also for the community. This should be seen also as a challenge for everybody. So it's very hard to calculate large trees. Okay, so we were able to get it to 29 and not anything larger. And typically it's really done with the depth minimization approach. Okay, so the larger number of trees that we were able to calculate are very small, and the larger trees, they seem to be very hard to calculate. Okay, so a conclusion and some remarks for future work. So we have implemented a new encoding for decision trees. I think the interesting thing about the encoding is that rather than modeling the tree as a graph, we model it as a set of paths. And that lets us control tightly the depth of the tree, because we just control tightly also the length of each of the paths. We also explored this search space splitting by topology enumeration that has turned out to be beneficial in practice. And by doing some careful optimization and implementation, we outperform existing work. Depth minimization in general seems to be better for targeting larger instances. So this is also quite interesting. It seems better just to consider more shallow trees, and then that probably limits the search space in a way that the SAT solver can reason about it better. Now, for future work, we would like to integrate in some more powerful scenarios, for instance, SMT-based synthesis. And we would also be interested in integrating our approach with some greedy approaches, so doing some hybrid, or maybe looking into some ensemble problems where the size or the depth is typically very limited. Okay, so that's all from me, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.